Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm the director of the John W. Kluge Center. From its founding, the Kluge Center has included an opportunity for members of the Library of Congress staff to come into residence and to work on projects of their choosing. I've traced the paperwork. It dates back to the very first fellowships offered by the Kluge Center. The Kluge Staff Fellowship is something that we now offer to 2 Library of Congress staff every year to pursue their own research for 6 months in residence. Those 2 scholars from the most recent cohort have had opportunities both last month and now to present about their findings, and I'm excited to learn from Betsy Haude about everything she knows about Mesoamerican paper, which, by the way, everything that I know about Mesoamerican paper I learned from Betsy Haude in the last several months. The Kluge Staff Fellowship, and I know there are a lot of library staff here, is going to be open for your application up through April 30th of this year. We have an information session tomorrow on February 5th in the Pickford Theater. So please take it seriously as an opportunity to pursue the great scholarship that we know is here. Betsy Haude is a conservator in the Conservation Division here at the Library of Congress. Her work on Mesoamerican paper is something that we are all going to benefit from because of she's been a leader in this field, a leader in this area of scholarship, and is now able to, after 6 months of quiet, secluded time at the John W. Kluge Center, to bring us her conclusions and her findings. So please join me in welcoming Betsy Haude.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to all of you for attending, both here in person and online. So I'm going to start by acknowledging something that some of you, maybe all of you, might be thinking, and that is, why paper? How could something as commonplace as paper possibly be interesting? For one thing, paper is a medium of communication utilized throughout the world, and as such provides insights into the cultures where it was produced and used. And by necessity, paper is connected to other materials. In this presentation, I will show how Maguey paper, that is, paper made from agave, was tied to the production and ritual surrounding a pre-Hispanic alcoholic beverage. And that rather than being a product unto itself, Maguey paper was part of the holistic multi-product use of agave. But before I dive into Maguey paper, I want to provide some background on the field of conservation and Mesoamerican manuscripts, which I hope will show why the study of paper deserves attention. A big part of conservation involves the conservator learning about materials of artifacts to understand their physical and chemical qualities, to aid in the assessment of their condition, and to determine the best preservation strategies for them. Many conservators, myself included, get quite excited about an artifact's materials and consequently specialize in certain areas. I specialize in the material aspects of Mesoamerican manuscripts created by indigenous artists in 16th century Mexico. My early work focused on the identification of pigments comprising the paints and inks on these types of manuscripts, but recently I have turned my attention to the papers used in their construction. So this is an example of a conservation treatment on one of the Mesoamerican manuscripts in the Library of Congress collections. 6 indigenous drawings were folded and sewn in between the pages of a bound manuscript. To prevent damage to the drawings from unfolding and refolding to view them, my colleague, book conservator Catherine Kelly, removed them from the book. Once removed, I flattened the drawings to make their informational content accessible, like we see in the drawing on the right. Its information, conveyed mostly through drawn images, pertains to the indigenous carpenters who constructed the church and its furniture for the pueblo of San Salvador, Huexotzinco. Conservation is an integral function of the Library of Congress because our work as conservators directly enables important programs here. Some of those programs include digitization, so that items can be accessed anywhere in the world on the library's website, exhibition, so that the American public can view our treasures up close, and research, so that scholars can use our collections in the library's many reading rooms. So now let's move on to Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is a cultural area and a geographic region that includes a large part of Mexico, all of Belize, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and some of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. The pre-Hispanic or pre-contact period refers to the time before the arrival of the Spanish in Mesoamerica. The early colonial period is the time directly after the Spanish made contact and is important because it exemplifies a blending of pre-contact Mesoamerican cultures and traditions with those introduced by the Spanish. This blending can be seen in artifacts like colonial Mesoamerican codices. Mesoamerican codices are generally thought of as pictorial manuscripts made in the native traditions of various Mesoamerican peoples, such as the Maya and the Mexica, who are more commonly known as the Aztecs. While a very small number of codices from the pre-Hispanic era have survived, many more from the colonial period have. These manuscripts were made in different formats, such as screenfold books, rolls, single panels, and European-style books. They were made of various substrates like skins, cloth, and paper, and they conveyed various genealogical, astronomical, and tribute information through pictographic writing, and from the 16th century onward, alphabetic writing. The Library of Congress has 4 early colonial codices in its collections that are important documents of the Americas. Their inclusion in the library's collections makes them accessible to the public and national and international Mesoamerican scholars. This is the Huexotzinco Codex that is part of the manuscripts division's collections here in the library. It was created in 1531 for the legal case that the conquistador Hernán Cortés brought against 3 members of the High Court in Mexico for stealing his property, which was essentially everything in the village of Huexotzinco. The 8 paintings shown here detail the types and amounts of items that were stolen, and they were also used as evidence in the trial. The Huexotzinco Codex is one of the earliest colonial manuscripts created solely in the indigenous style, in that its information is conveyed through images and its construction is of native materials. Indigenous Mesoamericans did not have a written alphabetic language before the arrival of the Spanish, but recorded various types of information in books and manuscripts using pictographs and glyphs like we see on these paintings. And I want to point out that there is no alphabetic writing on these paintings, except inscriptions in Spanish that were added when they were entered as evidence in the trial. Those inscriptions are on the backs of the paintings. What is remarkable to me about the Huexotzinco Codex is that there are equal amounts of the 2 Mesoamerican paper types, amate and Maguey. And it is because of this manuscript that I began researching Maguey paper. While a fair number of manuscripts on amate paper have survived, Maguey paper is rare. Until 2024, only 10 sheets of Maguey paper were known to exist in the world. The rarity of the Maguey paper intrigued me, and I was determined to find out more about it. But before I talk about Mesoamerican paper, I want to briefly discuss how paper is defined and made. True paper is essentially finely macerated plant fibers dispersed and suspended in water and then cast into a sheet on a screen. The conservation field here in the U.S. largely focuses on the history and production of European or Western-style artifacts. I'm a bit of a renegade in that regard because I've gone to Mesoamerica. So anyway, this print shows the steps for making European or Western-style paper. Paper making was a highly specialized skill that involved various craftspeople. European paper was traditionally made from cotton and linen rags, although rags made from hemp fibers were sometimes used as well. The rags were sold to paper makers by rag collectors who supplied them with discarded household items of clothing and other textiles. So what we see in this print is first the rags were sorted for their suitability for paper. Apparently the rags were quite dirty, and this was not a very pleasant job. They were then fermented and macerated to break down the fibers. And I don't know if you can tell this in this slide, but in the center top of this slide, for number 2, those are paper stampers that would basically tear apart the rags. So once the fibers were sufficiently broken down into a pulp, they were cast into sheets on screens that are called paper molds, and that's what you see at the bottom left. After removal from the paper molds, the sheets were pressed, separated, and dried by hanging them over ropes in drying lofts. I'm not showing it here, but Asian papers are made using a similar method, but also have some differences in their manufacture. And like European paper, they are considered true paper. Mesoamerican papers were made differently than European papers. The process involved beating or pounding softened plant fibers into a sheet on a flat surface like a wooden board using a stone tool. And these stone tools, called paper beaters or bark beaters, often had parallel grooves carved into them, like we see of that stone at the top right, and that helped to break down, flatten, and bond the fibers together. Because of the way in which these papers were made, they are not by definition considered to be true paper. However, the Mesoamerican scholarly community generally refers to them as paper, and I have adopted that terminology as well. So here we see the raw materials used for making Mesoamerican paper: ficus trees for amate and agave plants for maguey. The historic process for making amate involved cutting thick branches from the larger tree, like you saw in the previous slide, soaking them in a river or stream to soften so that the inner bark could be easily removed from the outer bark. Once removed, the fibers from the inner bark were cleaned in water before processing into sheets. Amate paper is still made today in an area in the Mexican state of Puebla, like we see in these photos. However, the trees historically used to make amate are endangered, and a different species is now used. And unlike the historic method, the inner bark from the trunk of the tree is now used, not the branches. Consequently, I have noticed that paper made today looks and feels very different than 400 to 500-year-old pieces of amate paper. Processing agave leaves to obtain the fibers within was very different than for amate. The agave plants from which fibers were processed to make textiles and paper were very large. To get at the fibers inside the leaves, the craftsperson had to contend with a thick, hard outer casing, as well as spines and caustic juices, which could cause injury. I want to point out that unlike amate, maguey paper is no longer made. In fact, there is no record of its manufacture after the 16th century. While there is very little written in the historical literature about processing the raw materials to make maguey paper, the ancient Mesoamericans made various other materials out of agave, like ropes, sandals, and capes. This series of photos was taken by Jeffrey and Mary Parsons, a pair of archaeologists working in the 1980s when various products were still being made from agave by indigenous communities in Mexico. So what we have here is the initial work of cutting the leaves off the plant at the left-hand side, and then the removal of the sharp spines that we see in the center so that the leaves could be safely transported. As I mentioned, agave leaves have a tough outer skin that must be softened before the fibers can be accessed. So after the leaves were cut, they were roasted on a fire and then placed in a pit to rot for several days. The rotting process also broke down the caustic juices, which prevented burns to the skin. After removal from the rotting pits, the leaves were washed to get rid of dirt and ash that would cause the fibers to become discolored. And the final step involved scraping with a blunt stone tool to separate the fibers from the pulp and the skin of the agave leaf. This slide shows two paper types from the 1531 Huexotzinco Codex in normal light, like what we see with our eyes, and transmitted light, where a light source passes through the paper. Notice that the marks made from the stone paper beaters are discernible in transmitted light. You can see that more light comes through the amate paper at the top than the maguey paper at the bottom, indicating that the maguey paper is thicker. This map shows two different climate regions in Mexico, one cool and arid, and the other warm and humid. There is ample evidence of amate paper making from the state of Morelos, and some evidence of maguey paper making in Tlaxcala and nearby areas of Puebla. When we think of paper, I suspect we primarily think of it as a medium for writing, printing, painting, and drawing. But in pre-contact Mexico, paper had many uses. It was also an important commodity. Paper was used as vestments and adornments for priests and deities. Here we see a sculpture of a person wearing a pleated paper headdress. On the right is a replica of a similar headdress that was excavated at the site of the Mexica capital, Tenochtitlan, in what is now Mexico City. Paper was also used for banners during ceremonies and celebrations. And finally, paper was used to record various types of information in books and single-sheet manuscripts. I should point out that no pre-contact Mesoamerican codices on paper have survived, except 4 Mayan codices. The paper of those manuscripts was identified as being from the inner bark of ficus trees like amate. The other 10 surviving pre-contact codices are on deerskin. One reason that no Central Mexican pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican manuscripts on paper have survived is because organic cellulosic materials like paper are extremely susceptible to biodeterioration. However, we also know that many of these manuscripts and other paper objects were burned by the Spanish and the Catholic clergy, as we see in this drawing from the Historia de Tlaxcala. And I don't know if you can make out, but there are paper banners and masks, and the priests are torching them. Currently, there are 8 codices that have definitively been identified on maguey paper. In the 1940s, the Mexican anthropologist Hans Lenz, who specialized in indigenous Mesoamerican papers, did a study of 40 codices at the National Library of Anthropology and History in Mexico City, where 3 were identified as maguey. Since then, 3 other manuscripts in their collections and manuscripts at the Library of Congress and the Newberry Library were identified on maguey paper. So here we see 3 manuscripts in the National Library in Mexico City. In the center manuscript, the area that is outlined in blue is the only section on maguey paper. The rest of the painting is on European paper. These are the 3 other maguey codices in their collection. Here are the 4 paintings on maguey from the 1531 Huexotzinco Codex that I talked about earlier. And what stands out to me is that the most colorful of the 8 paintings are on maguey paper. And the paper comprising the text of this manuscript at the Newberry Library was identified as being maguey in 2024 by myself and my colleague Sylvia Albro. It is a bound volume of Christian sermons written in the Mesoamerican language Nahuatl. With this discovery, there are now 59 sheets of maguey paper in the world. So how do we know if a sheet of Mesoamerican paper is maguey, since the 2 paper types look quite similar? The definitive method for distinguishing between them is through microscopic fiber analysis. Here we see the fibers from 2 Huexotzinco Codex paintings. The fibers of the amate paper at the top retain a tubular shape, whereas the fiber of the maguey paper at the bottom twists along its length. But the distinguishing feature of agave fibers is the presence of thinner fibers that zigzag, like the one protruding off the larger fiber. My project on Maguey paper was challenging because there is not much written in the historical or contemporary literature about it. Thus, I knew I would need to look at other products made from agave to try to understand more about it. I originally assumed that the production of Maguey paper was associated with the production of textiles made from agave fibers. And as I mentioned before, the ancient Mesoamericans made a variety of products from agave fibers. While there might be an association with Maguey textiles, I now believe that Maguey paper is more closely tied to an altogether different product made from agave. And that is the alcoholic beverage pulque. Pulque is a viscous, milky liquid made from the fermented sap of agaves. If you are familiar with tequila and mezcal, both of them are made from agave. They are made by distillation, which is a method introduced by the Spanish in the 16th century, and have alcohol contents between 35 and 55%. Pulque, on the other hand, dates to about 2,000 years ago, is made by fermentation, and has alcohol content between 2 and 5%. The production method and alcohol content of pulque are more similar to that of beer than tequila. Pulque is still made today, and although it was once considered a rural beverage, pulque bars have become quite fashionable in Mexico City and other Mexican cities. Agave plants are quite hardy and can grow in a vast range of conditions, from below sea level up to 3,000 meters, in humid, low-lying areas and cold, dry, high-altitude areas. They can also greatly range in size. The best agaves for making pulque are quite large and grow in the arid highlands of Mexico at 1,800 meters and above. These are the 6 agaves identified by the botanist Howard Scott Gentry as being the pulque magueys. And according to my colleagues Caroluso Gonzalez and Gabriela Cruz, who worked with the Maguey manuscripts at the National Library in Mexico City, agave salmiana and agave mapisaga were likely used to make paper. The process for making pulque starts by extracting the central cluster of leaves from the agave to create a well where the sap is collected, like you see on the left. The pulque harvester removes the sap several times a day using a pipette from a gourd, which you see in the center. The siphoned liquid is transported to larger vats for fermentation. Agave sap naturally ferments in about 36 hours, and pulque must be consumed within a few days because it quickly spoils. In these images, you can see the central cluster of leaves that is removed to initiate the sap collecting process for making pulque. Notice that these leaves are smaller and lighter in color than the leaves on the outside of the plant. Gentry, the botanist, mentioned that paper was made from the inner part of the agave. I came across something similar from the archaeologists I mentioned earlier who studied maguey fiber and pulque production. They said, and I quote, that the finest fibers come from the smaller leaves, usually whitish in color, that cluster in small numbers near the very center of the plant. They also said that these fibers were sought after for making very fine cloths, and that the makers of these fine cloths specifically looked for these smaller leaves after they were discarded for sap collection. I imagine that these same fine fibers would have been better for making paper than the coarser fibers in the large, mature outer leaves. As soon as the inner leaves were removed, I suspect they were processed immediately into paper. Since these inner leaves are small and spineless, roasting and rotting may not have been necessary. Softening the leaves through soaking, like the soaking of ficus branches for amate, may have been enough. And in fact, my colleague Itzel Sanchez is the only person I know who has made maguey paper in the ancient method. She soaked agave stalks in a river for 3 weeks before processing and pounding the fibers into a sheet of paper. About the time I established that maguey paper may be linked to pulque, I found myself once again looking at a map showing the pre-Hispanic archaeological sites where stone paper beaters were found. And then I started to think about areas that were devoted to worshiping the gods associated with pulque. The pre-contact Central Mexican religious system had many pulque cults that appeased various deities thought to control aspects of the natural and human realms. Pulque cults focused on agaves and their fermented sap, and pulque gods served as patron deities of specific areas. In pre-contact Mesoamerica, there were about 10 to 20 pulque cults and about 400 pulque gods. For right now, I am focusing on the areas you see in the slide, although pulque cults existed in more areas than these. The blue dot in Puebla is where Huexotzinco is located, the place where the 2 Library of Congress manuscripts originated. Paper beaters were discovered in 4 of the 5 areas of pulque cults on my map with the red diamonds. And here we see a few of the deities associated with pulque. Of the female deity Maguey, it is said that the very first agave grew from her bones, and that she discovered the process for boring the maguey to make the sap flow. Patecat in the center is recognized for discovering how to ferment the agave sap to make pulque. In Huexotzinco, one of the 400 pulque gods shown here with an agave and a foaming jar of pulque, has also been credited with inventing pulque. This is a scene from the Codex Borgia, a pre-contact book from the Puebla-Tlaxcala region. Here we see the goddess of agave, Maguey, on the right in front of a large agave, a large vessel of frothing pulque in the center, and a man drinking pulque on the left. The large pulque vessel is adorned with ritual papers with V designs on them. My friend and colleague, Dr. Barbara Mundi, suggested that the paper bib with the V designs on the Codex Borgia pulque vessel symbolized maguey paper, and that I should look into the paper's association with pulque rituals. After my conversation with Dr. Mundi, I became obsessed with representations of paper with V designs in Mesoamerican manuscripts, murals, and sculptures. Paper objects are well represented in codices like the Codex Borgia, but not that many of them have the V designs. Interestingly, the goddess Maguey, on the back of this Mexica pulque vessel, has ritual paper banners with V designs in her headdress, like we see on the pulque vessel from the Codex Borgia at the bottom. And the image in the upper right is a flattened rendering of the carving on the back of that vessel that I inverted to make it more legible for this presentation. Tepoztlan, a town in the pre-contact province of Huaxtepec, or present-day Morelos, was known for both its pulque cult and papermaking. It had a temple devoted to the god Tepoztecat, shown at the bottom left. Tepoztlan also made large amounts of paper that were paid as tribute to the Mexica. On the right is a colorful page from the Codex Mendoza that was created in 1541 in Mexico City and details the history of the Mexica, the tribute they demanded from other city-states, and a chronicle of their daily lives. Included in this page is the tribute paid in paper represented with the glyph for paper, the rectangle with a cord around it, and the glyph of the amount, a bag that denotes 8,000. While the tree for making amate paper grew in abundance in Huaxtepec, I have started to wonder if Tepoztlan made both amate and maguey papers. Since pulque was being produced in this area for its use in worshiping its pulque gods, I suspect that the extracted inner leaves were also used to make paper, especially since Tepoztlan was a manufacturing center for amate paper. The process for making the sheets of paper were identical, even if the fiber extraction and processing were different. While I do not have proof, I believe that maguey paper was made in more places and was more widely available than previously thought. Dating back to the 16th century, it has been assumed that maguey paper was mostly made in Tlaxcala. I and other colleagues who have studied maguey paper assumed that it originated from and was primarily used in Tlaxcala and Huexotzinco because the surviving manuscripts are from there. I am starting to reconsider the assumption that the production of Maguey paper was confined to these areas, since the Newberry Library's manuscript on Maguey paper was created in Mexico City, the site of the former Mexica capital Tenochtitlan. I am now inclined to think that Maguey paper was made in Mexico City, since its high altitude supports agave growth, it had pulque cults in the pre-contact era, and stone paper beaters were discovered there. In addition to Maguey paper being linked to pulque, I also think that agave cultivation and processing was a holistic endeavor that involved several craft specialists. Since agaves, especially those for making pulque, are large, they are difficult to transport. Cut agave leaves and pulque rapidly deteriorate, which is likely why neither the leaves nor the beverage show up on tribute lists like the Codex Mendoza. In addition, agave cultivation and processing were considered utilitarian, and fiber processing and pulque making were done in household settings and near agave groves. Maguey paper making was also likely done by households with access to agave fields. So this is what I propose about the holistic use of agave. During the initial use of the plant, pulque and paper were made. When the inner leaves were removed to start the sap production, they were immediately made into paper. Sap was siphoned off during this phase to make pulque. At the far right, we see a frothing pulque vessel from the Codex Borgia, and notice how similar this frothing pre-contact pictograph looks to a foaming barrel of pulque from the 1980s. During the sap collecting phase, the large mature agave leaves were cut and the fibers processed to make textiles, cords, and ropes like in the photo on the left. And when the agave plant was drained of sap and dried out, its leaves were used as building materials like we see on the right, where the roof of the hut is made entirely of agave leaves. After 6 months of researching Maguey paper, here are the conclusions I have drawn. First, Maguey paper was likely manufactured and used across a broader swath of central Mexico than I originally thought. Second, the production of Maguey paper was likely tied to the production of pulque, especially in areas with pulque cults. And lastly, rather than being a single commodity product, Maguey paper was part of a multi-craft endeavor that involved the holistic use of the pulque Maguey agaves. This last point is not dissimilar from European papermaking, which was also a multi-craft industry involving the holistic use of materials like discarded rags, various tradespeople like rag collectors, and specialized craftspeople in the paper mills. I will conclude by emphasizing that paper artifacts, like the ones I showed during this presentation, were made by people, highly skilled, living, breathing people. These paper makers were connected to their communities and to other industries, and as such, paper was also connected. In addition, many paper artifacts have a history, or a story, if you will. Thus, I would encourage you to keep this in mind the next time you're viewing an artwork or a document on paper, and not just think of it as just a piece of paper. And I'd like to close by thanking the Kluge Center for providing support and resources during my fellowship, and the Conservation Division for giving me the time away from my regular duties to delve into this research. The Kluge Staff Fellowship was one of the highlights of my time here at the Library of Congress, and I am truly grateful. And I also want to thank the people listed here for their help and support of me during my project. Thank you. I'll try to keep everybody in order, but.
I'm Tom Blake, staff here from Collections Digitization. I was just curious about the V shapes that you were talking about. Like, does that indicate just paper in general, or Maguey specifically, and why the V shapes?
Well, I don't know for sure if it is Maguey paper. Most of the paper in the codices are blank. They're blank white, like the big banners that I showed. Yeah, so these are interesting. They show up on various codices, but not that many. So it could be a link to Maguey paper.
For imaging objects from the Kislak collection,
Mhm.
I wonder if we should keep an eye out for the bees.
If you see any, please let me know. Yeah. I'll get Fritz and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
It's superb. Excellent. Thank you so much. In your conclusion, I could not help but think of Tepepulco.
Where
For two
Sahagún
reasons.
was? Oh.
Because Tepepulco was a major producer of pulque in the 16th century. And of course, that's where Sahagún did his very first ethnographical research. And so the fact that some of the Cerimonario might have Maguey paper, this is, is it a coincidence or something else?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because when I was working on that manuscript with People of the Newberry and then with Barbara Mundy and Ben Leeming, I originally thought the paper for that Newberry manuscript came from either Huexotzinco or Tepepulco because Sahagún spent time there. But then I started coming across references possibly to Maguey paper being made in Mexico City, and I thought, well, we don't know. So yes, it could be from Tepepulco. Thank you.
Transported the young leaves as a byproduct.
Yeah.
John Topoleski. So 2 points. One, I've been to Mexico a bunch of times, and I've eaten maguey worms and tacos. Right? And two, I was curious about like Cortés and using like his court case using the maguey paper was just like, lack of a better word, European paper sort of not available? Were they not, was sort of paper they didn't have like a whole bunch of paper like we have? I couldn't like, why did they use maguey paper, not just sort of like regular paper?
That's a very good question. Thank you. What I didn't mention and what I didn't show is this court case. These paintings were bound inside the court case. So the legal proceedings are written in Spanish on European paper. The reason that these are likely on Mesoamerican papers is because they were drawn, they were painted by the indigenous people of Huexotzinco, who basically were terrorized by, the Spanish conquistadors, former conquistadors. So I think it's what they were familiar with, and they were painting in their style with their materials. In the back.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Charlotte Scher, homemaker, not otherwise associated with Library of Congress. So just 3 very brief clarifications, if you would, for my own curiosity. First, you said that the codices are extant among, or exist among Mexica or Maya people. So were there codices among the Olmec, Toltec, or Teotihuacan people? Did they exist?
Possibly, and thank you for your question. And the archaeological part of it is not quite my area, but Matthew, correct me if I'm wrong here. The oldest piece of amate paper that we know exists comes from Teotihuacan. So yes, but we don't know. I mean, that could have been a headdress. It could have been a banner. It's just a tiny, tiny little fragment. But yes, I should say that the codices were made by the Nahua-speaking people and then the Maya, and then the Mixtec. So they come from like the Nahua area, but then some of them come from the Mixtec region, like in Oaxaca, and then there are the Mayan manuscripts, which are much earlier.
All right, thank you. And I'll limit it to one further question, clarification. That you mentioned that 10 of the codices were written on, 10 existing codices, surviving codices were written upon deerskin. So that reminds me of the European medieval practice of inscribing upon vellum. So question is that did paper, that is wood pulp technology, arise contemporaneously with the Gutenberg printing press? And was that a reason why paper, as we know it today, exists? Or is that something I should ask my large language model?
Well, paper predated the Gutenberg Bible. Paper was thought to be invented in China, and then it went through like the Middle Eastern countries and then came up through Spain into Europe. So it was around. Your question about vellum is interesting because the deerskin codices are nothing like parchment or vellum. They have a white gesso layer, so they're actually more like murals, like the way they would paint the murals in their temples. But I had a theory after looking at the Newberry Library manuscript, the way, it's written, it's handwritten, it's in an indigenous language, but it's the Roman alphabet. And when I looked at this manuscript as a conservator, there's ruling lines on the side, like most people, so you have your margins. And it also has a certain sheen to it. And I said to my colleague at the Newberry Library, and there was a great photo of her that was, I think, in the Chicago Tribune, holding one of those pages like this, just with the tips of her finger, and it was really rigid, not, like this is not rigid, right? And I said, I think they were simulating parchment. And when she looked at that closer, she said, I think you might be onto something because these Mesoamerican papers have a smooth side from being against the board, and they have a rougher side. And they put them together with the smooth sides together and the rough sides together like you would for parchment-bound manuscripts. So thank you for that question. Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. Phil Yorma, fellow in the Kluge Center. Building off one of the earlier questions about use of European paper versus indigenous paper, I'm wondering about if you have any thoughts about when Maguey paper was used as opposed to amate paper. So I know that when you were discussing the pages on the slide, that there was a moment at which you thought that maybe Maguey paper was particularly used for like colorful drawings or something like this. Although I take it that once you found all the Maguey paper at the Newberry collection, that's all just handwritten text, so maybe not so much. So I'm wondering, like, when would one be used or the other? I was also thinking maybe it had to do with the availability of the plants, but agave is like widely available, I take it, so it's probably not that like agave is unavailable and so you're using amate. So yeah, do you have any thoughts about when one was used as opposed to the other?
I do. So the only thing I could really base it on is working with the Huexotzinco Codex. So the amate papers are very thin, they're kind of floppy. And so we know, at least with the Mayan manuscripts, those are the only ones on paper, they were gessoed like what I was talking about. So it makes them very rigid. But the colonial manuscripts, they didn't gesso their papers. And so that means the amate papers are much more fibrous also. So I have a theory, and it's based on just very few manuscripts, so it's just a theory. But the surface of the Maguey papers is very smooth, and it's a very robust paper. So I think it takes the paints better, for one thing, and the iron gall ink, because iron gall ink can be quite destructive to paper, but this Maguey paper, it just sits on the surface. So part of me thinks from a material standpoint, it was a more robust paper type. But again, I'm only basing that on a very small sample.
The online audience? We have a question from the online audience, and it's, did Europeans recognize the usefulness of agave for beverages, paper, or anything else to the point that they considered cultivating it or did cultivate it in Europe?
I don't know about Europe, and thank you for that question. What I do know is that talking about pulque was, being drunk was frowned upon by the Mexica. And so, and Mesoamerican scholars can correct me if I'm wrong, but the people who were allowed to drink and get drunk from pulque were small children and the elderly, and priests and the nobility. And so there was quite a prohibition on getting drunk from pulque, but then once the Spanish came, they didn't have that same prohibition. And so at that point, or shortly after that, I don't know the date, pulque became an industry. They had haciendas. They started growing agaves in abundance. And so, yes, things did change, but I don't know about Europe.
With that, I think we can all thank Betsy for this marvelous presentation.